Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Books and Mortar with me, your host Razia, where we talk about the books that build us. So, before we get into the topic of this episode, there's a quote about reading by Alberto Manguel that I'd actually like to share with you. Maybe this is why we read, and why, in moments of darkness, we return to books to find words for what we already know. This is something that is actually so special to me about reading, that someone out there who on the surface actually shares nothing in common with you can articulate so succinctly feelings that you've had but you've actually been unable to express. So it's a type of connection for me. It's a form of like validation, and it even fosters a sense of belonging, I think, to know that you're not alone. So this episode focuses on the Wooster and Jeeves novels by P.G. Wodehouse. There's a lot of people who actually haven't heard of them, but they are just some of my favorite stories of all times. So if you read regularly, you might find yourself gravitating back to certain books when you're not sure what to read next, or when you just feel like reading something you know that you'll enjoy and will put you in a good mood. So, in other words, a comfort read. And my comfort reads are the Wooster and Jeeves novels by P.G. Wodehouse. I can't tell you how many times I've actually read each of them, only that I have about 14 books and a volume of audiobooks read by Stephen Fry, who is just fantastic. And he's actually been fortunate enough to play Jeeves in the TV series starring alongside Hugh Laurie, who plays an amazing Bertie Wooster. And you can find all of these full-length episodes on YouTube, actually. There were about 3 or 4 seasons, I think. And there's also other versions of the audiobook that's read by Martin Jarvis, who honestly, in my opinion, is Stephen Fry's equal in every possible way. And there's been a series of radio dramatizations on the BBC, and I even watched a theatre show of Wooster and Jeeves in Cape Town, which I think was just hands down the best production that I've ever seen. There was one guy who played Bertie Wooster, and there was another guy who then played Jeeves and all the rest of the characters as well. It was just amazing. So you really get the sense that these books are well loved. They're put on their stage. They were put on TV. They're audiobooks and they're written books as well. So P.G. Wodehouse has also written other series like Blanding's Castle and The Adventures of Smith with a silent P. But it's definitely the Wooster and Jeeves novels that have just captured the hearts of people so much more than others. So to just give you an idea of what the books are about, Bertram or Bertie Wooster is the main character of these stories along with his valet Reginald Jeeves, right? So Jeeves is a valet, he's not a butler. Let's make that distinction very clear, okay? So a butler is someone who is in charge of the household staff, while a valet is a gentleman's personal gentleman and sees to his needs only. So I learned the difference from P.G. Wodehouse, and I actually love correcting people. I mean, that's why we read, right? To lord our superior vocabulary over others. The books are set in the 1920s, where the English nobility are summering in the countryside or spending several months on the French Riviera, lunching at their respective clubs, taking in the latest show, and generally just gallivanting about town with no responsibilities and no financial worries either. They're looked after by maids, butlers, cooks, and valets who see to their meals, run their baths, lay out their clothes, and keep their houses clean. So Stephen Fry says in the foreword of the audiobook series that I have that none of us could actually fathom such an existence, but I don't think that's true. I could totally fathom that kind of existence, and it sounds like a dream. So the sun is always shining in Bertie's world, and he's always found with a smile on his face, provided that he has had his morning rejuvenations before you see him. And I relate to him completely in this regard. We also both hate early visitors, like before 11 a.m. I mean, what kind of hour is that to be receiving guests? He's also horrified when the ship docks at New York at some obscene hour of the morning, which is to say 6 a.m. So, Bertie is one of the most charmingly innocent, I think, and naive Englishmen that I've ever met in books. He is about 23 or 24 years old. His age isn't specifically stated. He's also an old Etonian, and he studied at Oxford. I have no idea what he studied, but he definitely doesn't work. He's sweet, he never gets angry, and he always tries to make everyone happy, which is actually his biggest downfall, especially people he went to school with. And this is how he describes himself in one of the books. If there's one thing I like, it's a quiet life. I'm not one of those fellows who get all restless and depressed if things aren't happening to them all the time. You can't make it too placid for me. Give me regular meals, a good show with decent music every now and then, and one or two pals to totter around with, and I ask no more. His biggest achievements of his life is winning the Scripture Knowledge Award when he was at school, and also contributing a piece called What the Well Dressed Man is Wearing to his Aunt Dahlia's periodical called Milady's Boudoir, and he references these achievements like frequently. So Jeeves describes him as a most pleasant and amiable gentleman, but mentally somewhat negligible. And this is how he keeps getting himself into trouble, and Jeeves has to find ways to extricate him. So Bertie quotes poets and authors. So he does seem to be intelligent in his own way, even if he doesn't quote them very well. But I think his vocabulary is actually quite impressive. But at the same time, I think that he learned a lot from it from Jeeves. The language that Bertie favors is apparently pre-World War I English, and he uses phrases like what ho and pip pip. He's very creative with his English, and he won't say, walk because that's boring. Instead, he'd say toddle, leg it, or make tracks. So he also abbreviates some of his phrases, like my H was not L, meaning my heart was not light, or Jeeves brought over the old eggs and B, referring to eggs and bacon, which I just love. It's something that I've never read something like that before, and I thought it was just such a creative way to do things. It's quite unique. So there's a piece from My Man Jeeves, which is a collection of short stories where Bertie is introduced to a fellow named Mortar, right? And to give you an idea of how they speak to each other, this is how their introduction goes. What ho, I said. What ho, said Morty. What ho, what ho. What ho, what ho, what ho. After that, it seemed rather difficult to go on with the conversation. And that's like pretty much it. So I don't know if it takes a specific sense of humor to enjoy things like this, but I generally like British humor. So I think that's also why I enjoy these books so much. So Bertie's friends and family are well aware that Jeeves is the brains of the outfit here, much to Bertie's annoyance sometimes. And the schemes that Jeeves comes up with are actually pretty simple. Like, for example, asking a friend's uncle for a favor after he's eaten because then he's more likely to be in a good mood. Or when he suggested to one of Bertie's friends, Bingo, to read his ailing uncle famous stories of gentlemen who fall in love with working class women to make him more amenable to the idea that Bingo wanted to marry a working class woman. So it's quite simple and straightforward, right? Other schemes of Jeeves's, though, are actually quite clever and they're not as simplistic. But generally speaking, you really have to just take these books at face value. There are no layers to them. There are no hidden meanings. They are what they are. And what they are is little rays of literary sunshine to brighten even the dreariest of days. Bertie and Jeeves are very different characters, and you get the feeling that Jeeves actually has to sometimes stop himself from rolling his eyes at the situations that Bertie gets himself into. But luckily, Jeeves is always there to help him, unless he wants something from Bertie. So generally, Jeeves usually expresses disapproval over some change that Bertie has made to his appearance or his dress. Jeeves is very traditional in that sense when it comes to dress and image, while Bertie is actually more willing to take a fashion risk, right? So, for example, Bertie's mauve socks or a white mess jacket that he bought in France and now dares to wear in England, silk dinner shirts, or the unthinkable time he grew a moustache. So the only leverage Jeeves has, I suppose, is to then refuse to help Bertie with his many predicaments because I'm sure it's not really in his job description. But as Bertie says, if you give them a what's its name, they take a thingamy. So Bertie tries to hold his own and he tries to stay strong against Jeeves' disapproval. But sometimes his need for help is so overwhelming, or his gratitude is so much that he actually always just ends up giving in to Jeeves, right? So to give you an example about the issue of the moustache, this was in a short story called Jeeves and the Hard-Boiled Egg. So Bertie says, you see, I had decided, rightly or wrongly, to grow a moustache, and this had cut Jeeves to the quick. He couldn't stick the thing at any price, and I had been living ever since in the atmosphere of bally disapproval till I was getting jolly well fed up with it. What I mean is, while there's no doubt that in certain matters of dress, Jeeves's judgment is absolutely sound and should be followed, it seemed to me that it was getting a bit too thick if he was going to edit my face as well as my costume. No one can call me an unreasonable chappie, and many is the time I've given in like a lamb when Jeeves has voted against one of my pet suits or ties. But when it comes to a valet staking out a claim on your upper lip, you've simply got to have a bit of the old bulldog pluck and defy the blighter. So this paragraph, the first time I read it, it really made me laugh. Staking out a claim on your upper lip. So Jeeves, while he is one of the main characters, he mainly observes from the sidelines and he'll only venture an opinion if he's asked for it, right? So Bertie always describes him in a very flattering light, and he's always the consultant of choice for Bertie and his friends when they find themselves in some difficulty or the other. And they attribute his intelligence to all of the fish he eats, right? Because fish is good for your brain. So Jeeves can also be a bit manipulative, and he's very good at it because he knows Bertie really well. It's all about the psychology of the individual, and he's able to twist poor Bertie around his little finger, and his schemes are actually sometimes quite ingenious. Jeeves also has his dry sense of humor. So giving you an example here from the inimitable Jeeves, Bertie asks, "How does he look, Jeeves?" "Sir? What does Mr. Bassington look like? It is hardly my place, sir, to criticize the facial peculiarities of your friends." And then he goes on to speak about this Bassington family, the Shropshire Bassingtons, the Hampshire Bassingtons, and the Kent Bassingtons. England seems pretty well stocked up with Bassingtons. Tolerably so, sir. No chance of a sudden shortage, I mean, what? Presumably not, sir. And what sort of specimen is this one? I could not say, sir, on such short acquaintance. Will you give me a sporting 2-1, Jeeves, judging from what you have seen of him, that this chappie is not a blighter or an excrescence? No, sir, I should not care to venture such liberal odds. So just examples of, the conversations between them and the type of English that P.G. Wodehouse uses. It's just so different compared to anything else that I've ever read. Even other like historical books that are set sort of in a similar time, it's just never been like this. So in addition to Jeeves and Bertie, there's also a cast of other characters who pop up in most of the books, the most popular of whom are Bertie's two aunts. So one of them is Aunt Agatha, who he says eats broken bottles and is strongly suspected of turning into a werewolf at the time of the full moon. And then the other one is his Aunt Dahlia, who is a sound old bird who rode for the corn or pitchley, which are fox hunts. And if she ever turned into a werewolf, it would be one of those jolly breezy werewolves whom it is a pleasure to know. So although Aunt Dahlia does actually get Bertie into a scrap or two, I think she's asked him to steal the same piece of silver at least on 2 separate occasions. He's infinitely fonder of her than he is of his Aunt Agatha. So his Aunt Agatha keeps trying to marry him off, and she keeps getting him engaged to various females, saying that he needs to settle down and have children, much to Bertie's terror, because Bertie is an affirmed bachelor. Then there are his old school friends. You have Augustus or Gussie Finknottle, the newt lover, and Richard or Bingo Little, the Romeo, who along with Bertie are members of the Drones Club, where they spend a lot of their time. So there are a few others that also pop up once or twice, like Augustus or Tuppy Glossop, Bertie's twin cousins Eustace and Claude, Stinker Pinker and Stilton Cheesewright. So you can see that all of Bertie's friends have nicknames, which I love. And they are the ones who get him into these frightful pickles, because on his own, Bertie is a quiet, relaxed kind of cove, except on boat race night. That is the rowing race between Oxford and Cambridge, when, if ever, you will see Wooster under the influence and stealing policemen's helmets. It's a bit of a tradition with him to steal a policeman's helmet on boat race night. Then there is the array of ladies. We have Madeline Bassett, who Bertie just cannot stand. He calls her that Bassett disaster. He can't handle her because of the things she says. For example, the stars are God's daisy chain, and every time a fairy sheds a tear, a wee bit star is born on the Milky Way, and he cannot deal with it. Then there is Honoria Glossop, who is the daughter of psychiatrist Sir Roderick Glossop, who's convinced that Bertie is as nutty as a squirrel's hideaway. So Bertie describes Honoria as one of those robust, dynamic girls with the muscles of a welterweight and a laugh like a squadron of cavalry charging over a tin bridge. A beastly thing to have to face over the breakfast table. I think she scares him, to be honest. He also says that she's the type of girl who would make you play like 16 rounds of tennis and 3 rounds of golf, and then still expect you to be fresh as a daisy at dinner to discuss philosophy and ethics. So the other one of note is Miss Florence Cray, or Lady Florence Cray, I suppose. Bertie had a soft spot for Florence at one point, and he thought her to have a really beautiful profile. But as he says, looks aren't everything, because you can't spend half your life moving around trying to see a girl sideways. Florence is an academic and she's a writer, and she spent some time engaged to Bertie. So the things that all of these girls have in common is that they think that Bertie is dearly in love with him, and they all want to mold him after they get married to him. Interestingly, except Madeline Bassett, right? But Florence Cray and Honoria Glossop are set on molding Bertie. This means that he must stop smoking, he must stop drinking, he must stop spending time with his friends at the Drones Club, and worst of all, he must get rid of Jeeves. So whenever one of these girls break up with their current betrothed, they use Bertie as a backup, who, because of his genuine gentlemanly acumen, cannot refuse a proposal of marriage, but then he proceeds to fret about it and asks Jeeves to get him out of it. So the last one I read was Aunt's Aunt Gentleman, and it sits quite far down the list of books. You can find the reading order online, but it does seem to be a little bit contested. I actually followed the order that I found in my books, and it starts with The Inimitable Jeeves, and then Aunt's Aunt Gentleman is number 14, which is actually, I think, the last sort of full-length novel that P.G. Wodehouse wrote about Bertie and Jeeves. And then there's another one called The World of Jeeves, which is like an omnibus of short stories. So to give you an idea of like the types of plots that you can expect in these novels, the synopsis of Aunt's Aunt Gentleman goes like this. Bertie Wooster has been overdoing metropolitan life a bit, and the doctor orders fresh air in the depths of the country. But after moving with Jeeves to a cottage at Maiden Exford, Bertie soon finds himself surrounded by aunts. Not only his redoubtable Aunt Dahlia, but an aunt of Jeeves's too. Add a hypersensitive racehorse, a very important cat, and a decidedly bossy fiancé, and all the ingredients are present for a plot in which aunts can exert their terrible authority. But Jeeves, of course, can cope with everything, even aunts and even the country. So in this one, Bertie takes to the countryside to relax and take a break from city life because he got sick. So at a communist march, he runs into a girl named Vanessa, to whom he used to be engaged. So he wasn't actually attending the march, he just happened to be passing by. And he figures that he really dodged a bullet now with Vanessa, because he couldn't see how he would be able to find domestic bliss if the little lady was going to be attending protest rallies and lobbing things at policemen's heads. He eventually finds out that she's engaged to an old acquaintance of his, Orlo Porter, who is super suspicious that Bertie knows his fiancée and is convinced that he's there to try and win her back. So Bertie really protests, but shame the poor guy, nobody listens to him. He's thrilled, though, to hear that his Aunt Dahlia is around in Maiden Exford, but then he quickly changes his mind when she propositions him with a scheme to ensure that the racehorse she has bet on wins. Because if she loses, her husband is going to be really upset with her. So it turns out that this particular racehorse is very fond of a certain cat. And if the cat isn't there, the horse won't perform. So this cat is eventually stolen and returned on 3 separate occasions. And who has to deal with this? Bertie. Why does he agree to it? In his defense, shame, he initially doesn't, right? But through coercion, emotional manipulation, blackmail, and his insistence on always being the gentleman, people somehow always seem to convince him of the absolute worst ideas. Eventually, poor Bertie gets so entangled in it all that he goes to Jeeves for help. So all of these books are written in the form of Bertie's memoirs, right? And they're all written from his perspective, except one, which is from Jeeves's point of view, and it's called Bertie Changes His Mind. So if you happen to pick them up out of order, Bertie is actually kind enough to give you a summarized history when he mentions certain characters, right? So how they fit into his life. So there's also another story where Bertie is absent completely, and in this case, Jeeves is working for someone else for a time in a book called Ring for Jeeves. So Bertie is actually off on a class about social revolution, and he's learning to darn his own socks. So there are also three books that are written by other authors in tribute to Wodehouse. So the one is by Sebastian Faulks, who wrote Jeeves and the Yuletide Spirit. I don't know if you've ever read any of Sebastian Faulks's works, right? But I've read one of them, and that guy is super emo. So I wasn't sure how he was going to emulate Wodehouse's signature lightheartedness and humor. And I felt that he did just an okay job. So Ben Schott is the other author, and he wrote Jeeves and the King of Clubs, which was a bit better. There's also a sequel to Jeeves and the King of Clubs, and I didn't actually know about this one. But the interesting thing is that both Sebastian and Ben seem to want to get Bertie married. And I mean, Bertie is a confirmed bachelor, so I don't know why they're so they're so keen to get him married. So I've never read another author who can manipulate the English language in such a hilarious way, and I think this is a huge reason why Wodehouse's books have persisted through the decades. So honestly, sometimes prose is so well written that I take a moment and I think that this is the same language that I use, but I don't have that kind of command over it. And it comprises of 26 letters, and here it is laid out as just a complete work of art. Words can touch the soul and move you in such a way is really incredible. It reiterates the power of words. And another book that did that for me was The Name of the Wind by Patrick Rothfuss, but like in a completely different way. So anyway, Wodehouse's use of English language is truly phenomenal, and his sense of humor really stands alone. So while I was, thinking about this particular episode and about P.G. Wodehouse, there's something interesting in that there's recently been a move by publishers to remove some words from the Wodehouse books that they deem modern readers may find offensive. So you can imagine that there must be some offensive language and behavior in these books given the time period they're set in, which is the 1920s, and also the social standing of your main characters. And this is now obviously a very contentious issue, right? Where does censorship end? How will it affect the story, and how will it affect the authenticity of a book? So personally, I don't believe in censorship. I feel that if we remove things that are deemed offensive, firstly, where does it end? I feel, that there's a never ending list of things that could be deemed offensive by different groups of people. Secondly, I think that we need to know where we've come from as a society and where we are now. If we're never exposed to the bad things of the world, we'll never be able to start conversations about them and actually then start to heal. So we read, we see, and we learn, right? Removing words or events that certain groups feel others might find offensive is very dangerous ground for me. So it got me looking into this a little bit more. I've heard of the concept of banned books, and I don't agree with banning books either. Honestly, I feel like if you want to make sure that a book gets read by as many people as possible, ban it, right? So there was a post actually on Instagram by Penguin Random House that I liked about book banning. And it said that book bans fundamentally inhibit students' discovery and discussion. When we censor authors, we assert that only those views which we wholeheartedly agree with deserve to be heard and considered. Moreover, we abolish opportunities for critical thinking and relinquish our right to challenge current conceptions. It's like the Google algorithm, right? It will only show you articles that express viewpoints you already agree with. If you haven't watched this documentary called the if you haven't watched this documentary called The Social Dilemma, you should really watch it. It's absolutely terrifying. And it tells you how the algorithms of the social media platforms work and how the algorithm of Google works. That it will only show you articles that hold viewpoints with which you already agree. And that is just completely messed up because there's no challenge to your brain or to your critical thinking, which is why books and stories are so important. And then there's a list of the 15 most banned books that Penguin released as well. So this was quite interesting, right? So the first one is Beloved by Toni Morrison. I've read that one. The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which I've also read. Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison, which I've read. Ulysses by James Joyce, haven't read that one. As I Lay Dying by William Faulkner. The Bluest Eye by Toni Morrison. I've read that book several times. I really, really loved that book. Forever by Judy Blume. Mouse by Art Spiegelman. 13 Reasons Why by Jay Asher. I Am Jazz by Jessica Herthel. The Name Jar by Young Suk Choi. Me and Earl and the Dying Girl by Jessie Andrews. So that's a list of the 15 most banned books. And this is usually the US. So the USA still has lists of banned books, but as far as I know, South Africa doesn't have a list of banned books. And when I say banned, I mean banned by the government and not banned by individual institutions, right? Because you get schools that will ban certain books from their library and say that they don't want the kids to access it on the school premises. So although I'm familiar with banned books, rewritten books is a new concept for me. So there are actually books that have been rewritten, right, with the permission of the owner of the works to make them more accessible to modern readers. And this seems to happen more for children's books. So when I say rewritten, I don't mean in the sense that the entire story has been changed, but I mean like certain words in the books have been altered or removed. So for example, Enid Blyton's Famous Five series. So words have been changed in there, like mother and father have been rewritten to mommy and daddy. Pull over has been changed to jumper. And, while they don't go as far as to give the characters smartphones, they try to make the language more relatable to modern children. But interestingly, this has not shown to actually boost sales of the book. And another one that has been censored or rewritten, actually, I suppose, is Roald Dahl. So in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, Augustus Gloop is no longer described as enormously fat. He's just enormous. And Mrs. Twit is no longer ugly and beastly. She's just beastly. So personally, I don't think it was necessary to remove these words, and they could have sparked a conversation around people's feelings and having empathy for others, right? It was also interesting because I recently watched The Devil Wears Prada, and Meryl Streep uses the word fat to describe Anne Hathaway. She says, instead, I hired the fat girl. And I was just like, we are then rewriting our books, but we're not editing our movies. So, where does the sensitivity there come from, and where is that offense? So I just feel like if you're going to do it for one medium, then you should do it for all of them. And I mean, really, So other examples were actually based in the classroom. And I suppose that I can understand this one. I imagine that it would be uncomfortable for teachers to stand in front of a class of young children and then read a book aloud that contains offensive language. For example, in the US, the N word. So a professor apparently went through the laborious task of changing each N word to the word slave in To Kill a Mockingbird, because he felt that it was a shame that the book would otherwise be removed from the curriculum because the teacher wouldn't be comfortable saying the N word in front of the class. So I don't belong to this racial group, so I'm not going to really venture an opinion here. To Kill a Mockingbird is, I think, widely acknowledged as one of the greatest works of literature of our time. And it's apparently inspired a lot of people to actually become lawyers and human rights defenders. And I think that it would be a shame to not have more people exposed to that particular work. So this same word is used in one of the Wooster and Jeeves novels, and it was mentioned that the publishers wanted to remove it. So I will say that there's also the use of a derogatory word for Indians in one of the stories, but there's no mention by publishers of removing that word. So not to mention like the horrible ways that women are treated and spoken about in books, which I find offensive and honestly just annoying because that narrative never seems to change. So you see what I'm saying? Offense is subjective. So I would read a book one way and you would read a book another way. And it's very difficult when you start down the slope because you don't know where it's going to end. And I'm very interested to hear in what you think on this topic. So if you're feeling up to it, leave me a comment or send me an email with your thoughts at booksandmortar@gmail.com. It's obviously a very contentious issue and it can really be quite polarizing. But yeah, it would be interesting to hear your opinion. So, coming back to it, the Jeeves novels are rated rather well on Goodreads, most of them scoring higher than 4 out of 5. I'm sure that these are fans of the books like me who rate all of them 5 stars. But I highly recommend these books if you're looking for a quick, light-hearted read. They average fewer than 200 pages per book. I read them over and over, and I listen to them on audiobook as well. They're so easy to consume, and they really do brighten your mood. I found most of my books at exclusive books, but it was quite a while ago. But if you'd like to collect them, I'm sure that you can find them online, or that your nearest bookstore will be able to source them for you. So thanks so much for listening. I hope that you found this one interesting. And until next time, this is Books and Mortar with me, your host, Rizia, where we talk about the books that build us. Bye.